The night air in the small town was heavy with the low hum of streetlights, their glow bending across empty sidewalks. 17-year-old Jamal had only been walking home from basketball practice, his gym bag slung loosely over his shoulder, sweat still drying on his forehead. But in America, sometimes the most ordinary walk can turn into a nightmare. Two police cruisers screeched to a stop beside him, their red and blue lights slicing through the dark. "Hands where we can see them!" The shout was sharp, almost venomous. Jamal froze, his palms instinctively rising into the air, his bag sliding down his arm to the ground. His heart hammered in his chest. He hadn't done anything. He knew it. They knew it. But here he was, spotlighted, cornered, prey. One officer stepped out, his boots crunching against gravel. His hand rested far too comfortably on the grip of his gun. "Out late, huh? What's in the bag?" Jamal opened his mouth, but no words came out. His tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. He wanted to say, "It's just my basketball shoes, sir. My practice jersey." But he knew words didn't matter. The story was already written in their eyes. Black boy, alone, guilty by existence. Without warning, the second cop yanked him forward, shoving him hard against the hood of the cruiser. Jamal's cheek scraped hot metal, and his breath fogged against the glass of the windshield. "Stop resisting!" one officer barked, though Jamal hadn't moved a muscle. A knee drove into his back. His arms were twisted, cuffed too tight. Pain exploded across his shoulders. He gasped, his chest crushed under the weight of power that had no restraint. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, phones pressed to windows. Some recorded, most stayed silent. Fear hung thicker than the night air. And then, the unthinkable. They dragged him, cuffs biting into his wrists, his body scraping against rough asphalt as they pulled him across the street like he was nothing more than a sack of trash. His knees tore open, jeans shredding, gravel embedding into raw skin. His eyes burned, not from tears, but from humiliation, from the choking realization that he was just another name, another body, another story that might never make it to the morning news. The last thing Jamal saw before the black boot pressed against the side of his face was a porch light flick on across the street. And then, the faint, unmistakable rumble of engines. Heavy ones. More than cars. More than trucks. Engines that belonged to something else entirely. Because Jamal's mother was coming, and she was not coming alone. The engines in the distance faded for a moment, but Jamal's mind could not escape the weight pressing him against the hood of the cruiser. The officers had no idea what was on its way, and neither did Jamal in that moment. His world narrowed to the smell of oil on metal, the burn in his shoulders, and the shame that settled deep in his bones. He was just a kid, but right then, pinned under badges and boots, he felt like nothing more than a statistic waiting to happen. Earlier that evening, before the flashing lights and the sirens, Jamal's life had been ordinary, or at least as ordinary as life could be for a 17-year-old black boy in a town where his very presence was often treated as a threat. He had stayed after practice, shooting hoops in the echoing gym long after his teammates left. His coach, a tired man in his 50s with graying temples, had clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Keep working, Jamal. You've got a shot." College ball, a scholarship, a way out of this place where streets whispered danger even when they were quiet. But home wasn't far. He lived with his mother, Captain Alana Brooks, though no one in town ever called her that. To the neighbors, she was Miss Brooks, the strong, quiet woman who raised her son alone. To Jamal, she was just Mom, though even he sometimes forgot the weight of the life she had lived before this town. Her medals lay tucked in a shadowed drawer. Her uniforms hung neatly in the back of her closet. Her years in combat were stories untold, because she never wanted her boy to see war etched into her eyes. She had fought for freedom in deserts half a world away, but now she fought every day for something more fragile: the chance for her son to grow up safe. Alana had left the army 5 years ago after a final deployment overseas. She came back scarred, though not all scars were visible. A convoy she commanded had been ambushed. She had lost soldiers under her watch, and their names lived with her in silence. Coming home, she had sworn she would never again watch a young life be destroyed by forces wielding power without care. Her new mission was raising Jamal, protecting him, and teaching him discipline and pride. What she could not protect him from, though, was the world's prejudice. The looks in the grocery store, the subtle clutching of purses when he passed, the cop cars that seemed to shadow him just a little too closely whenever he walked home. That night, Alana was at home ironing her uniform, not the camouflage she once wore, but the crisp white shirt she now wore at the local veterans office where she worked as a counselor. She had the TV on low, barely listening. Her mind drifted to Jamal. He was late, but that wasn't unusual. She pictured him with a ball in his hands, sweat on his brow, stubborn determination in his eyes. Her boy was a fighter in his own way, just like her. But then her phone buzzed. A neighbor's number lit up the screen. She answered casually. "Hello?" The voice on the other end trembled. "Alana, it's Jamal. The police, they've got him. They're hurting him." Her chest tightened instantly. "Where?" she snapped, her voice slipping into command mode without hesitation. The neighbor gave the location, the corner of Jackson and Pine, just 2 blocks away. Alana didn't think. She didn't breathe. She didn't even hang up the phone. Her training roared back to life, sharper than any memory, louder than any fear. She grabbed her keys, but as her hand touched the doorknob, her eyes flickered to the framed photo on the mantel, a photo of her old unit, men and women in desert fatigues, standing shoulder to shoulder. Brothers and sisters in arms who had promised they would always have each other's backs. Some had gone into private security. Some had stayed in the military. A few, like her, had settled back into civilian life. But all of them had remained bound by an unspoken oath. Her hand moved from the doorknob to her phone, fingers dialed faster than thought. She called one name, then another, then another. Her voice was steady, clipped, urgent. "I need you. Now. It's Jamal. Jackson and Pine. Bring the trucks." Because Alana Brooks wasn't just Jamal's mother. She was a commander who had once led convoys through hostile fire. And tonight, she was about to lead another one. Meanwhile, Jamal's world shrank under the flashing red and blue. "You like acting tough, huh?" one officer sneered, dragging him further. His knees bled freely now, streaks of crimson staining the road. "Maybe a night in a cell will teach you some respect." The other officer chuckled darkly. "Nah, kids like this don't learn. Best we can do is show him what happens when you walk the streets like you own 'em." Jamal's breaths came in ragged gasps. His mind flickered between terror and fury. He thought of his mother, how proud she always told him to stand, how she reminded him that his worth was not defined by how others saw him. But it was hard to feel proud with his face pressed against concrete, with boots grinding him into dust. And then the sound again, distant at first, but unmistakable to anyone who had ever lived on a base. Engines, heavy diesel, multiple vehicles. The low, thunderous growl of something far more powerful than squad cars. The cops stiffened, their laughter faltering. They looked at each other, unease flashing in their eyes. "What the hell is that?" one muttered. What it was the past coming for them. A past carried on steel wheels and armored plating. A past commanded by a mother who had once stared down deserts of fire and refused to yield. And she was almost there. The rumble grew louder, rolling down the narrow streets like thunder before a storm. At first, Jamal thought it was just his imagination, his brain reaching for anything to drown out the sting in his chest and the ringing in his ears. But the officers holding him heard it too. Their movements faltered. One loosened his grip on Jamal's arm, glancing up. The other straightened, squinting into the darkened street. Then headlights turned the corner. Not the sharp, staccato glare of police cars, but a steady, heavy glow, too high off the ground to belong to anything ordinary. The sound of engines multiplied. 1, 2, 3, maybe more. The ground beneath Jamal seemed to hum. "What the hell is this?" one officer muttered, stepping back instinctively. The first truck appeared, painted in matte black, reinforced bumpers glinting under the streetlights. Behind it came another, and another, each one rolling slow and deliberate, forming a convoy that looked less like it belonged to a small American town and more like it had rolled straight out of a war zone. Doors slammed open, boots hit pavement. Men and women in tactical gear stepped out, their movements sharp, disciplined, unhurried. They weren't kids playing soldier. Their posture alone told a story. Combat veterans, trained to move as one. And then the driver's door of the lead truck opened. Alana Brooks stepped out. She wore no uniform, no insignia, just jeans, boots, and a jacket. But the weight of command radiated from her. Her eyes locked on Jamal, still pinned to the pavement, blood streaking his knees. In that instant, every memory of convoy ambushes, of watching soldiers fall, of fighting to protect those under her command, all of it crashed into the sight of her son on the ground. Her voice was calm, but carried the steel edge of command. "Get your hands off my boy!" The two officers froze. One tried to smirk, masking nerves with bravado. "Lady, this is police business. You're interfering in a mother's right to protect her child," Alana cut in, her tone like a blade. She took a step forward, and with her, half a dozen veterans fell into line behind her, spreading out with deliberate precision. Their presence transformed the street. What had been two officers and a boy was now a confrontation between unchecked power and disciplined force. The officer's hand twitched near his holster. One of Alana's veterans saw it and stepped closer, his voice low, steady. "Don't even think about it." Jamal, struggling to push himself up, blinked in disbelief. He had seen photos of his mother in uniform, standing beside men and women in desert gear. But he had never seen her like this, commanding, unflinching, with warriors at her back. The officer yanked Jamal upright, shoving him against the hood again as if to prove control. "This punk resisted arrest. You're all making a mistake." "Resisted?" Alana's voice rose, anger sharpening. "He's a child walking home, and you dragged him across the street like an animal." The growing sound of voices broke through the standoff. Neighbors were stepping out of their houses now, phones in hand, recording. Some whispered Jamal's name. Others gasped at the sight of the armored convoy filling their quiet street. The red and blue flashes from the police cruisers painted over the matte black trucks, creating a surreal tableau. "You're gonna regret this," one officer spat. "No," Alana said coldly. "You are." The air thickened with tension, a silence heavier than sound. Even Jamal felt it, the shift in power, the fragile line holding the scene together. One of the veterans, a tall man with a scar running down his jaw, leaned in close to Alana. "Orders?" he asked, his voice low, deferential. Alana hesitated. She wasn't on a battlefield anymore. These weren't insurgents. They were men in uniform, sworn, at least in theory, to protect. But tonight, they had crossed a line. She couldn't unsee the blood on her son's legs, the fear etched in his eyes. She also couldn't ignore the crowd growing larger by the second. Cameras pointed like weapons of truth. "Hold the line," she murmured to her people. "But no one touches a trigger unless they do first." The officer gripping Jamal shoved him again, as if testing boundaries. Jamal winced, but stood straighter this time. Something about his mother's presence, the convoy behind her, the neighbors with phones raised, it gave him strength. For the first time since the flashing lights pinned him, he felt like maybe he wasn't alone. "Ma'am," the officer sneered, "step back, or I'll charge you with obstruction." Alana's laugh was cold, humorless. "Obstruction? Do you know who I am? I've led convoys through war zones where men like you would have broken in 5 minutes. You think I'm afraid of your threats?" The officer faltered, his mask of authority cracking. His partner, younger and less certain, glanced around nervously at the cameras, the veterans, the trucks. The balance of power was slipping, and he knew it. Then, in the distance, another sound cut through the night. Sirens. Reinforcements. Jamal's stomach tightened. More cops. His mother's convoy was strong, but more badges meant more guns, more danger. He looked at her, silently pleading, but Alana's eyes were locked forward, calculating. She had seen standoffs like this before, and she knew the next 10 minutes would decide everything. The convoy veterans subtly shifted, forming a barrier between Jamal and the incoming sirens. Neighbors whispered, some cheering softly under their breath. A woman's voice rose, "Don't you touch that boy again." Another man shouted, "We're recording everything." The police reinforcements arrived, half a dozen cruisers screaming into the intersection. Doors flew open, officers spilling out with hands near weapons, eyes widening at the armored trucks that dwarfed their cars. It looked less like a routine arrest and more like the opening of a war zone. One of the senior cops strode forward, shouting, "What's going on here?" Alana answered without flinching. "Police brutality. Against a minor. My son." The officer scanned the scene, the bleeding teen, the veterans in formation, the neighbors with phones recording from every angle. His jaw tightened. He knew this was spiraling beyond their control. Still, pride wouldn't let him yield. "Ma'am, stand down, or there will be consequences." Alana stepped closer, her voice steady enough to chill the air. "Consequences? You already crossed that line. The only question now is whether you'll walk away with your careers intact, or crawl away with the world watching." The street held its breath. Engines idled, red and blue strobes painting shadows across faces. Jamal's heart pounded, caught between fear and awe. He had never seen anyone stand against the police like this, let alone his mother. He whispered, barely audible, "Mom!" She turned her head just slightly, enough for him to see the fire in her eyes. "I've got you, baby. They're not laying another hand on you." The officers shuffled uneasily, the sirens still wailing behind them like a dirge. The balance was razor thin, ready to snap into chaos or into justice. And in that fragile moment, the world waited for someone to make the next move. The street was no longer just a street. It had become a stage, lit by the flicker of patrol lights, headlights, and the jittering glow of dozens of phone screens. Jamal stood at the center, bruised and bleeding, but now shielded by the wall of veterans his mother had summoned. The police, reinforced and tense, formed their own line across from them. Every breath felt heavy, like the air itself had weight. Every second stretched too long, every gesture magnified. "Final warning!" the senior officer barked, his voice cracking just slightly under the pressure. His hand hovered above his holster, not quite touching it, but close enough to send a ripple of unease through the crowd. "Stand down and disperse, or we'll move in." Alana's boots echoed against the pavement as she stepped forward. She didn't raise her voice, but it cut clean through the night. "No, not tonight. Tonight, you answer for what you did to my son." Gasps rippled through the neighbors, emboldened by her defiance. Phones rose higher, capturing every twitch of movement. The officers glanced uneasily at the lenses staring back at them. They weren't used to being the hunted, but tonight, their power was unraveling under the gaze of truth. One officer, the same one who had shoved Jamal, sneered and lunged as if to grab the boy again, an act of reckless dominance, a desperate attempt to reassert control. But he never made it. In an instant, two veterans stepped forward, intercepting him with military precision. They didn't strike. They didn't even raise their hands aggressively. They simply blocked him, their stance wide and immovable, bodies a wall between the boy and the man who had brutalized him. The officer stumbled, shocked, his authority evaporating as the crowd erupted in shouts. "Get your hands off that kid! We're watching you! Cowards in uniform!" The street was no longer silent. It was alive, roaring, condemning, recording. Jamal, though his knees trembled, found his voice rising too. For the first time, he shouted, his voice raw with rage and courage he didn't know he had. "You don't own me! You don't get to treat me like I'm nothing!" The crowd cheered, the sound swelling like thunder. The officers flinched, realizing the tide had turned. The senior cop shouted, desperate to reassert control, "All units, move in!" But the words barely left his mouth before Alana raised her hand. Her convoy veterans shifted in unison, every movement deliberate, their presence radiating a dangerous calm. They didn't brandish weapons. They didn't threaten. But the message was clear. If you cross this line, you won't walk away unscathed. For one suspended heartbeat, the two forces faced each other, police and veterans, badges and combat scars, arrogance and discipline. The line between war zone and neighborhood blurred, a powder keg waiting for the smallest spark. And then, a voice boomed from the crowd, magnified by a megaphone one of the neighbors had dug out of his garage. "We see you! The world sees you! Put your hands down!" More voices joined, chanting, building into a rhythm that shook the night. "Justice for Jamal! Justice for Jamal!" The chant grew louder, spilling from one block into another, until it felt like the entire neighborhood was awake, marching toward the street. The officers glanced at each other nervously. No training prepared them for this, not when the tide of humanity itself was rising against them. The senior cop barked again, but his words were drowned out by the roar. He raised his hand to signal forward movement, and Alana stepped directly into the center of the street. "Look at him!" she shouted, pointing at Jamal. Her voice tore through the chaos, carried by fury and grief. 17 years old, walking home from practice, and you dragged him through the street like his life meant nothing, like my child didn't matter. Her eyes locked on the senior officer. But he does matter. And tonight, the world knows it. The veterans flanked her, forming a V behind her body. Jamal stood at the center of it, no longer hunched, no longer cowering. His shoulders rose, his chest expanded. For the first time, he looked like more than a boy. He looked like the spark of something greater. The police line wavered. Some lowered their hands. Some shifted uncomfortably under the relentless recording of phones. One muttered, "This isn't worth it." But the officer who had brutalized Jamal refused to yield. He snarled and shoved past his own line, spitting venom. "You people think you've won? You think this circus means anything? He's just another thug." The crowd exploded in outrage. Shouts, boos, curses rained down. But before it could spiral, Alana's voice sliced through, sharp and merciless. "Say it again." The officer froze, startled by the calm venom in her tone. "Say it again," she repeated, stepping closer, her face a mask of fury barely contained. "Call my son a thug again. Call him worthless. And say it while looking me in the eye, while the whole world is watching." Every phone leaned in. Every voice went silent. The officer's mouth opened, then closed, his bravado leaking out like air from a punctured tire. His face reddened, his eyes darting for escape. But there was none. "You can't, can you?" Alana spat. "Because the truth is standing right here. My son is not a thug. He is not worthless. He is not invisible. He is the reason this street is awake tonight. And he is the reason men like you will finally be held accountable." The officer stumbled backward, his authority shattered. The crowd roared, not with fear, but with triumph. And then, like a domino falling, the senior officer lowered his hand. Slowly, reluctantly, but undeniably. "Stand down," he muttered to his men. "Stand down." The police line dissolved, retreating toward their cars under a chorus of boos. The two officers who had brutalized Jamal hung back, pale and trembling, caught in the merciless eye of dozens of cameras. They couldn't run. They couldn't hide. Their faces were already burned into the feeds of live streams exploding across the internet. Jamal exhaled shakily, his body trembling from adrenaline. His mother stepped beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders, pulling him against her. For the first time that night, her voice softened. "You're safe, baby. They can't touch you now." He clung to her, tears burning his eyes. Not tears of weakness, but of release. Of knowing that someone, his mother, his community, the veterans who stood like sentinels, had refused to let him be erased. The climax broke not with violence, but with victory. Not with bullets, but with truth. The convoy trucks idled, silent witnesses to a battle fought and won on a suburban street. The neighbors cheered. The chants rose again, shaking the night. Jamal looked up through blurred vision and realized something he would never forget. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every black kid who had ever walked home and feared the lights behind them. This was about a community rising, a mother's unbreakable love, and a fight too old to be ignored any longer. And in that moment, as police cars retreated and chants thundered into the night, Jamal understood. This was only the beginning. The night didn't end with the retreat of police cruisers. It lingered like a wound refusing to close, raw and alive under the glow of street lamps. The red and blue flashes faded into distance, but the chants still pulsed in the air, echoing off houses and into hearts. Jamal stood in the center of it all, his chest heaving, his hoodie torn, blood drying on his cheek. For a moment, he felt weightless, caught between the horror of what had just happened and the awe of what had been born out of it. The crowd was no longer just neighbors. It was an army of witnesses. Phones still pointed his way, not at him as a victim, but at him as a symbol. His mother's hand remained firm on his shoulder, grounding him. Alana looked into his eyes, her voice low, trembling with both exhaustion and resolve. "They wanted to make you small," she whispered. "But look at you. You're bigger than them now." The veterans fanned out, not as aggressors but as guardians, ensuring the retreating officers didn't circle back. Some neighbors approached hesitantly, offering bottles of water, jackets to drape over Jamal's shoulders. A grandmother from down the block placed her trembling hands on his face and said softly, "Baby, you're all of us tonight." Jamal tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't used to being the center of anything except suspicion. Now, with eyes on him, he felt the weight of something far heavier than shame. He felt the weight of expectation. A teenager from his school pushed through the crowd, phone in hand, live stream still running. "Bro," he said, voice shaking, "you're trending, like, everywhere. They're calling you the kid they tried to break but couldn't." Jamal blinked, the words not fully sinking in. The kid showed him the screen, his name, his face, already plastered across social feeds. Clips of the officer lunging, the veterans blocking, his own shout of defiance. It was all there, looping endlessly into the night. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a boy who wanted to go home, take a shower, curl up, and disappear. But when he saw the faces around him, eyes glistening, lips trembling, hearts wide open, he realized home had changed. The whole neighborhood had become his home now. Alana stepped forward, her voice rising again, not as a battle cry this time, but as a sermon. "What you witnessed tonight," she said to the crowd and the cameras, "wasn't just about my son. This was about every child who's been treated as guilty for daring to exist. This was about every mother who prays her baby makes it home safe. They tried to drag my son through the street like he was nothing. But what they dragged into the light was the truth." Her words spread like fire, feeding the chants that swelled again. Justice for Jamal. The rhythm carried into the night, into feeds, into living rooms far beyond their block. But eventually, the noise quieted. People drifted back to their homes, still buzzing with adrenaline, still clutching their phones. The veterans retreated to their convoy trucks, nodding solemnly at Alana before driving away. The street slowly returned to silence, broken only by the occasional bark of a dog or the soft hum of engines fading. Jamal and his mother walked home together. He leaned heavily on her, his body sore, his spirit raw. The porch light of their house glowed like a beacon, and as they stepped inside, the world outside felt 1,000 miles away. But silence didn't mean peace. Inside, Jamal collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. His mother knelt in front of him, wiping the dried blood gently with a wet cloth. She didn't speak at first, just let the quiet wrap around them. Then finally, she said, "I know you're scared, and I know you're angry, but I need you to remember, what happened tonight doesn't define you. What you did tonight does." Jamal lifted his head, eyes wet but burning. What if they come after me again? What if this doesn't stop? Alana's throat tightened, but she held his gaze. Then we fight again, and again, until they learn we're not afraid. Until they learn we're not alone. For the first time since it began, Jamal managed a small, tired smile. The days that followed blurred into one another. News vans crowded the block. Commentators argued on TV screens about proper police procedure and youth accountability. But the footage spoke louder than any spin. People saw the truth. Officers dragging a boy like an animal, a mother arriving with the weight of her past, and a community refusing to bow. Protests sparked across the city, fueled by Jamal's story. Strangers sent letters, donations, offers of legal help. Jamal's school held assemblies. His teammates hugged him in the locker room, whispering apologies for every time they hadn't spoken up before. But there was darkness too. Threats arrived in anonymous messages. Online trolls twisted his name into slurs. The officers involved were placed on administrative leave, a phrase that felt like salt in an open wound. Justice was still far from certain. Yet through it all, Jamal changed. He carried himself differently. His steps were slower, but firmer. He spoke less, but when he did, his words landed heavy. He began writing, scribbling in notebooks late at night, trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to shape pain into purpose. One evening, weeks later, he stood before a crowd at a community center, his voice trembling but strong. I didn't ask to be a symbol, he told them. I just wanted to get home safe. But if my story means fewer kids have to feel what I felt that night, then I'll carry it. I'll carry it for all of us. The room erupted in applause. Alana watched from the back, tears streaking her cheeks. She saw not just her son, but the man he was becoming. The man she had fought to protect. The man the world had almost stolen, but couldn't. And in that moment, Jamal realized the truth his mother had carried all along. Survival itself was an act of defiance. And love, louder than sirens, stronger than fear, was the greatest weapon they had. The story of that night never disappeared. It lived on in hashtags, in chants, in classrooms and kitchen tables. It became part of a bigger story, one that stretched far beyond Jamal and Alana, one about resilience, justice, and the unyielding love that can turn a single street into the front lines of history. And so, as the video of Jamal's defiance continued to ripple across the world, one question lingered in the minds of everyone who saw it. Neighbors, strangers, mothers, sons. How many more Jamals will it take before the dragging stops? And more importantly, who will rise the next time to say, not tonight, not ever again?